Nefarious is a horror movie starring Jordan Belfi and Sean Patrick Flannery of Boondock Saints notoriety. I saw the trailers a few times when I visited movie theaters in 2023, but because it appeared to be objectively bad, I had no interest in watching it. That was until I was spending a lovely quiet October evening doing one of my favorite activities, browsing Tubi for a milquetoast flick to put on while I crochet and drink tea. It was on an evening like this that I saw Nefarious again and decided to watch it. I was happy to give this movie a proper watch now that the stakes were lower, to see if it looked as bad as it was marketed. The story the trailer suggests is a simple chamber piece involving a man on death row and the psychiatrist sent to evaluate his mental health and determine whether or not he is legally insane and therefore can't be executed for the murders he's committed. I love a chamber horror as much as the next person. I mean, Pontypool, The Autopsy of Jane Doe, Wait Until Dark. Put interesting characters and an interesting situation in one room for 2 hours and I'll eat it up like fresh pakora. But Nefarious looked rather boring. The biggest hook for audiences is the question of whether or not this seemingly human man is actually a demon, a question that whoever cut the trailer together is so intrigued by that this is a key part. Is he? Isn't he? He is. Is he is or is he ain't? Watching Nefarious was vindicating. It was just as boring as I suspected, but more than that, it didn't function as a horror movie at all. It was really just a theological debate, and before you get excited about that because you're thinking it could be comparable to something like Heretic, hold your horses. Nefarious is less of a heretic and more of a God's Not Dead. In fact, the most surprising thing about this movie, considering its content, is that it's not actually a Pure Flix production. Dr. James Martin visits an Oklahoma prison to undertake the psychiatric evaluation of serial killer Edward Wayne Brady, who insists he's actually a demon named Nepharamus. Nepharamus tells Martin that before he leaves the prison, he will have committed 3 murders, and over the course of their conversation, often mistakenly described as a battle of wits, Nepharamus reveals that 2 of the murders he's talking about not only happened in the past, but are also not murder, citing the assisted suicide of Martin's mother, a woman who is wasting away from an aggressive form of cancer, and the abortion Martin's girlfriend goes through with as 2 examples of violent murders the doctor has committed.
Can you imagine the agony the carpenter feels when we rip a child to pieces inside its own mother's womb? Because that's what we do, James.
Oh man, is that what I'm watching? It's probably clear to you as it was to me that this isn't really a horror movie. It's a lecture cosplaying as a horror movie and doing it really badly. It's not as if the use of debate, be it political or theological, can't be the framework for a fictional story. From 12 Angry Men to My Dinner with Andre, these kinds of movies, where it's really just a conversation, can be just as exciting, sometimes even more than, a movie where there are explosions going off every 5 seconds. When it's effectively done, it makes for a captivating watch and leaves you with a lot to think about, which is why I have to give Nefarious some credit. It wasn't a captivating watch, far from it, but what Nepharamus had to say about assisted suicide, and especially abortion, stuck with me. Rather than leaving me to mull over whether assisted suicide and abortion constitute as murder, I was mulling over how often we see pro-life or pro-choice sentiment reflected in horror movies. I guess in this case, a so-called horror movie, intentional or not. Evil Dead Rise, along with being a gory affair, is simply about motherhood. Beth discovers she's pregnant, and being unsure of what to do, she pays a visit to her older sister Ellie, who's now raising her 3 kids alone after her deadbeat husband walked out on the family. As Evil Dead tradition goes, someone has to be possessed, and the first person who contracts the curse of the Deadites is Ellie. And Ellie pushes back tooth and nail against the possession for as long as she can, fighting for the cognizance needed to keep her children safe. The possession takes hold, a lot of people die, and by the end of the movie, Beth has survived, and her valiant efforts to protect her family awaken something maternal within, prompting her to follow through with her pregnancy. Plenty of horror movies have been made about motherhood, but only a few have tapped into the darker recesses of the unconscious mind, using the monstrous feminine to examine things like postpartum depression or psychosis.
And all I could think about was how much I wanted to cut you all open and climb inside your body so that we could stay one happy family.
But the reason I include Evil Dead Rise here is not because of its themes on motherhood exactly, but rather one tiny moment, a brief exchange between Deadite Ellie and Beth as the latter is cornered and almost overtaken.
I will swallow your soul.
souls.
Among certain sects of people, talking about this moment is a bigger abomination than Mia. According to some, to even discuss this moment is to put emphasis on an unimportant detail in a movie that is not now, nor has it ever been, remotely political. To that I say, everything is political, even if it's not intended to be, and on a lighter note, analyzing things is just fun. Live a little. This line by itself was another thing that prompted me to think about how reproductive health and its rhetorics were framed in horror movies. It's important to note that in the Evil Dead franchise, a deadite will say just about anything to taunt its victims. Saying 2 souls to Beth is the perfect way to fuck with her head. Doesn't mean Lee Cronin spends his spare time picketing outside of Planned Parenthood. Of course, all of this got me thinking about the scope of reproductive horror. There's all sorts of reproductive horror. There's the horror of pregnancy, which operates as a kind of body horror, where a person is terrified about something growing inside of them. There's the horror of motherhood, which can either be about postpartum depression / psychosis, or about the aftermath of raising a child and being afraid of how they turn out, questioning if your parenting is where it went wrong. Things like we need to talk about Kevin and the entire genre of evil children movies like The Bad Seed, Children of the Corn, or The Good Son, which is basically the bad seed, or a horror movie about the loss of identity and isolation that new mothers can experience. Please be aware that I did not cover every single piece of media that has to do with pregnancy or reproductive horror. Not only was that never going to be the plan, but obviously when you're writing an essay you have to cut things or else we'd be here all day. I also didn't talk about Delicate because I didn't want to subject myself to a Ryan Murphy show. I mean, there's a lot of things I don't talk about, like Dumplings, Immaculate, Proxy, Grace, Dead Ringers, because I'm still convinced I'm going to make a video about it one day, even though I've been saying that for a long time now. But if I give up hope now, what will I live for? It goes without saying that my exclusion of a film or a TV show is not meant to, dismiss it as part of the genre. But I'm gonna say it anyway. There are also numerous books and essays that helped me form this video, and many of them will be referenced, and they'll all be linked in the description. Now let's begin. The same month and year Nefarious was released, Alexis Jacknow's film Clock debuted on the streaming service Hulu. Ella, a 37-year-old woman, undergoes a new trial that she hopes will give her a maternal instinct and make her want to have children. I have more respect for the concept of this project than enjoyment of it. Writer-director Jacknow made it clear that the only reason this was a horror movie was because making a movie about pregnancy and bodily autonomy was easier when it was pitched as a horror project.
I think that if this had just been a straight drama, I don't know if a movie about female body autonomy would have gotten made. And if you wrap it, if you hide the vegetables, if you wrap it in entertainment, if you wrap it in, horror or thriller or even comedy, people are more likely to sit up and pay attention.
Clock being released in 2023 is also relevant to the conversation because it's part of what I can only describe as a new wave of reproductive horror. In 2024, we had a case of twin films with the release of Arkasha Stevenson's new lease on the Omen franchise, The First Omen, and Immaculate, directed by Michael Mohan. The release of these two movies during the same month ignited a conversation about the new spotlight on reproductive horror and the influx of modern films made with the theme of birth and autonomy. This uptick was widely considered to be a result of the Supreme Court's overturning of Roe v. Wade in June of 2022, and yes, this decision is definitely one of the reasons we're seeing more of these stories, but I don't think it's fair or accurate to pin it all down to this particular moment. Not because I think the overturning of Roe v. Wade is irrelevant, but because even though was ruled back in 1973, abortion remained a controversial subject that bore the brunt of aggressive pushback. That's partly why the B. Arthur-led sitcom Maude, created by Norman Lear and Bud Yorkin, incurred such wrath after airing its 9th and 10th episode of the first season titled Maude's Dilemma. The episode, which aired a few months after the Supreme Court's decision, saw Maude grappling with whether or not to terminate an unexpected pregnancy at the age of 47. The studio was flooded with letters of objection from anti-abortion groups, as were the show's sponsors, who were initially going to run ads on episodes during reruns, but backed out after receiving complaints. Many of these sponsors were later boycotted by pro pro-abortion groups. It was a mess. The way the subject was handled in the episode was done with an almost casual matter-of-factness that's really refreshing and forward-thinking given the time period. It's not this maudlin affair where Maud has a breakdown or where her decision is met with judgment and scorn by her friends and confidants. It's dramatic, but in a comical way. The episode starting with Maud busting through her living room door and stomping out her anger, falling into hysterics over the loss of her free time and terrified at being a mother of an Eagle Scout by the time she turned 62.
Oh, Vivian! I was just coming into the prime of my life. I mean, Carol is bound to get married again. I was even thinking about having the sofa recovered and getting new carpeting. I was even toying with the idea of having my eyes done. I was back to Dr. Spock and Spit Up and...
17 years after this episode on November 6th, Degrassi High would kick off its first season following the kids we first met in Degrassi Junior High and a few we met even earlier on The Kids of Degrassi Street. It was a two-parter special called A New Start. The main plot followed Erica, who after a brief romance at summer camp discovers that she's pregnant and struggles with what to do. She knows she's too young to have a child and she doesn't even want to have a child, especially not at 16. But her Christian faith puts her at odds with her own desire to terminate the pregnancy. Erica agonizes in secret until she confides in her twin sister Heather, who begs her not to get an abortion. In a really fantastic scene, Erica brings up the topic of abortion in her classroom, which leads to a passionate debate among her classmates, some who are staunchly pro-choice and some who are pro-life. Erica sits quietly as the voices start to overlap around her, frozen and terrified. Also in the classroom is Spike, a character who became a mother at the age of 14 and drops her daughter off at the daycare center before heading to school every morning. Spike's friend Liz is against abortion and prompts Spike to speak up about the issue, to which Spike says,
"Just because I had Emma doesn't mean I know what's right."
The episode ends with Erica choosing to get an abortion and begging her sister to go with her, as she doesn't want to face the anti-abortion protesters alone. Heather refuses. She talks to Spike, hoping that Spike, being a mother, can convince Erica to keep the baby. And once again, Spike displays wisdom beyond her years.
Could you try? She might listen to you. You're a mom. Oh, right. So I'm an expert. Having an abortion was wrong for me. Maybe she feels it's right for her. But you just said it was wrong. For me. But that was my choice.
At the time of this episode airing, the decriminalization of abortion in Canada, not just abortions in specific conditions, was still relatively new, with Section 251 of the Criminal Code having only been officially struck down in 1988. The episode incurred some controversy, not only for its frank discussions on abortion, but because it was happening to a teenage character. In 1989, there were 42,133 teen pregnancies, a slight increase from 1988 and 1987. Degrassi has always aimed to be a show to frankly cover taboo subject matter, not for shock value, but because it was important for kids to see some of the things they were facing to be discussed in some capacity. A New Start aimed to do that for any teens watching. It was an episode about the abortion debate, but it was also a really informative one that included a scene of an abortion technician sitting down with Erica and discussing exactly what was going to take place. Watching this episode in 2025 was really interesting because it is such a nuanced and informed dissection of the subject matter, and some of the teenage characters handled it with much more maturity than a group of 30-year-old women would later do in 2004. Girlfriends, created by Mara Brock Akil, was a groundbreaking show depicting the love lives and sex lives of 4 Black women as they navigated their careers and life changes in Los Angeles. There's a lot to love about Girlfriends, and I rarely pass up an opportunity to rewatch it, but the way abortion was handled was an all-time low for the series. In season 5, after Tony has wed to Todd, she finds her relationship is on the rocks, and to make matters worse, she's pregnant. Having never seen herself as a mother, Tony only wants to keep the baby in the hopes that it will repair her marriage, but in the end, Todd files for divorce, and Tony wants to have an abortion. She presents the idea to her friends, and this is how it goes. And this was in 2004, when Roe v. Wade had been in effect for 30 years. My point in mentioning 3 different TV shows that have nothing to do with the horror genre is just to paint the picture of how often reproductive rights have been under attack. So the import of horror centering around reproductive health can't be simplified as simply a response to the repealing of Roe v. Wade. It's a response to the culture in general. Many of the women making these films, like Michelle Garza-Cervera, director of Hesera the Bone Woman, or Arkasha Stevenson, would have come of age during increasing culture wars against abortion and or birth control, and their work would naturally reflect that.
Well, this is a movie about birth. If we're talking about how Damien was born, we're talking about birth, which means we're talking about the female form, we're probably talking about forced reproduction, we're talking about rape, like we're talking about some very serious issues. Also, this was, we were in Texas pitching when the 6-week ban was passed in Texas. We were in the midst of it all.
Talking about these topics in a time where, when we started making this movie, Roe was still in place, and then by the time we were finished, it was gone.
We're also seeing an increase because we're seeing more women directing horror more often. For a long time, horror and sex were similar in that, for some reason, a lot of people believed women didn't enjoy either one. And it's not like we've never seen stories about pregnancy or autonomy in horror. Like Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, which, alright, if you want to get particular, you're not going to find that in the horror section of the library, but we all know what the deal is, right? Or John Wyndham's The Midwich Cuckoos, which was later adapted into the 1960 classic Village of the Damned. But to be fair, Wyndham doesn't put a spotlight on forced pregnancy as much as he uses it as a plot device for something else. Better yet, the guy who may be responsible for not only the cinematic popularization of domestic horror, but for arguably the entire Omen franchise. Ira Levin, acclaimed author of Rosemary's Baby and The Stepford Wives. When I told people I was working on a video about reproductive health in the horror film genre, the first thing they would say to me, without hesitation, was, "You've got to talk about Rosemary's Baby." Rosemary's Baby is the first movie to come to mind for many. The novel, first published in 1967, is not the first story to add a sinister spin to pregnancy, but in many ways it became a trailblazer in the niche genre. When Levin first conceptualized the idea, he was concerned about the pregnancy element, worrying that if he wasn't careful, it would be too similar to Wyndham's Darling Cuckoos. So instead of aliens, he went with Satan, and here we are nearly 60 years later still thinking about demonic pregnancies. Rosemary's Baby is about a young woman, Rosemary Woodhouse, who, after moving into a luxurious Manhattan apartment with her husband Guy, is quickly and unwittingly enfolded into a satanic plot to create the Antichrist. Rosemary and Guy befriend a quirky older couple, Roman and Minnie, who just so happen to be devoted Satanists. Guy, a working actor, does rather well for himself, but when the opportunity presents itself to get a role that will change his life, he makes a deal with the devil. But what's sold is not Guy's soul, rather the womb of Rosemary. Guy exploits Rosemary's interest in having a child to fulfill this scheme by drugging her and offering her body to Satan. After Rosemary becomes pregnant, she's advised by Guy and her new neighbors to see one of their physicians, Dr. Saperstein, instead of her regular obstetrician, Dr. Hill. Although this story is about the occult and sacrificial rituals in the Antichrist, a lot of the terror that unfolds, that continues to make audiences feel on edge to this day, has nothing to do with the devil and everything to do with being a woman in 1967. From her financial dependency on her husband to her valid fear of being dismissed as pregnancy paranoia, Rosemary's experiences reflect the obstacles that were facing countless women whether they were pregnant or not, like loss of autonomy, medical malfeasance, and marital rape, just to name a few. As she carries the baby to term, her health gets worse, her skin sallow, her cheeks sunken, and she worries, rightfully so, about her health and the viability of the pregnancy, only to be told time and time again that everything is fine, that the baby will be fine, or that she's just being paranoid. Rosemary wants to have a child. She wants to have her baby, and part of her fear of Roman, Minnie, and increasingly Guy is that they're going to do something to her child, that they want to take her baby away or use it for nefarious reasons. During one scene where Rosemary visits her old friends, they try to talk to her about seeing a different doctor, getting a second opinion, because they're worried about what the pregnancy is doing to her health, and Rosemary is adamant that an abortion is not something she wants.
Rosemary, pain like that is a warning that something isn't right. Go see Dr. Hill. Go see anybody besides that nut. You can't go on suffering like this.
I won't have an abortion.
Nobody's telling you to have an abortion. Just go to see another doctor, that's all.
The domestic setting allows us a closer look at the isolation Rosemary experiences before her pregnancy and even more so during. After becoming pregnant, she loses all autonomy as the people around her fret over what's growing inside her, paying no attention to how it's wreaking havoc on her body and her mind. At one point, she reaches out to her previous physician, Dr. Hill, desperate for help and seeking safety. But instead of taking her concern seriously, Hill just calls her new doctor, who then calls her husband, who then takes her home. There's also, of course, the fact that Rosemary only gets pregnant after being drugged, raped by Satan, and lied to by her husband, offered up like a platter. Guy tries to convince Rosemary that the night they were planning to attempt conception, she fell asleep and he went ahead and had sex with her while she was unconscious. This element of the story, positioned next to the demonic pregnancy and the crazy-making actions of the satanic cult, is sometimes minimized. But if we're talking about Rosemary's loss of autonomy, this moment can't be ignored. When the novel was published in 1967 and when the movie was released in 1968, marital rape wasn't even considered a thing in the eyes of American law, and it wouldn't be criminalized for another 26 years. Still, Rosemary's reaction to Guy's comment and the way she wears betrayal and disbelief on her face is perfectly played. Not only because it captures her devastation at Guy's actions, but you also get the feeling that even she is struggling to verbalize or rationalize her feelings. After all, there's nothing in the law that says it's wrong, so maybe she's the crazy one for feeling so violated.
I didn't want to miss baby night.
You...
And a couple of my nails were ragged, and it was kind of fun in a necrophile sort of way. I didn't want to miss the night.
Levin's main reason for writing a horror story about pregnancy was the idea of hiding the horror from the audience. For the 2003 New American Library edition of Rosemary's Baby, Levin wrote for the afterword, "Having observed that the most suspenseful part of a horror story is before, not after the horror appears, I was struck one day by the thought, while not listening to a lecture, that a fetus could be an effective horror if the reader knew it was growing into something malignly different from the baby expected. 9 whole months of anticipation, with the horror inside the heroine." Sometimes I question whether the feminist themes in stories like The Stepford Wives and Rosemary's Baby was intentional at all. The way Levin would tell it, The Stepford Wives wasn't supposed to be this big statement on the societal pressures and constraints of womanhood. In 2002, Mary McNamara conducted an interview with Levin to reflect on The Stepford Wives for its 30th anniversary. She wrote, "Ira Levin says that when he published The Stepford Wives 30 years ago on October 13th, he was not attempting any sort of social commentary. He was just trying to write a good thriller. A reference and future shock to domestic robots had piqued his interest. And then he happened across an article about the presidential animatrons at Disneyland. Of course, he was going through a divorce while he wrote the book, and that, he admitted at the time, might have colored his view of domestic living a tiny bit." At the same time, though, it would be unfair to suggest that Levin had no idea what he was writing when he wrote Rosemary's Baby. To suggest that he was entirely unaware of how Rosemary's struggles, getting anyone to believe her, mirrored many women's experiences in medical settings. In 1992, as part of the catalog for the American Jewish Committee Oral History Collection, Levin was interviewed by Suki Sandler and was asked at one point whether he wondered how people who read his stories came up with the theories that they did. "Sometimes you see a whole sheaf of reviews from different people, and don't you ever wonder how they saw that in your play? Yes. Or how they found whatever it was they describe. It can be very surprising. Can you think of any examples?" Well, not so much critics really, but certainly in the wake of Rosemary's Baby, I've gotten letters from psychiatrists and from doctors who say, "This is such a wonderful picture of postpartum depression and postpartum psychosis." I'd say, no, she was absolutely right. They really were witches. It's important to note what Levin is saying here, because Rosemary's Baby, upon its release, was read by some critics and theorists as being representative of postpartum psychosis. Levin doesn't seem to be questioning whether Rosemary's Baby is an indictment of the restrictive gender politics of the 1960s, a reflection of society's treatment of mothers, but he does contest the idea that Rosemary's experiences could be reflective of prenatal or postpartum psychosis. That distinction is important. Too often in real life, as well as in fiction, women are told that their worries or their pains are in their heads. To make Rosemary's experiences out to be a depiction of postpartum psychosis puts the chaos around her in her head, reducing the betrayal and perversion as nothing more than hysteria or hallucination. Here he says it can't be a depiction of psychosis because the threat is not in her head, it's all around her.
Abe says it's called prepartum. I don't know, it's some kind of a hysteria. Boy, you were really kapow out of your mind.
As Karen Valerius writes in her essay, Rosemary's Baby, Gothic Pregnancy, and Fetal Subjects, more than one reviewer of the film dismissed Rosemary as delusional and classified the plot as a paranoid fantasy. To attribute Rosemary's fears and suspicions to psychosis is to refuse a political interpretation of the narrative, by failing to recognize that sexist social relations that conspire against her, and indeed by failing to recognize any meaningful relation between the narrative and historical reality. In films like Swallow, which is not really a horror movie, but frankly I'd feel weird not discussing it, and Hesera the Bone Woman, grappling with the tedium of domesticity and loss of self is the truest terror of all. Swallow, written and directed by Carlo Mirabella Davis, is about Hunter, a young housewife who spends her days preparing the perfect meals, dressing to the nines, sitting at home, and playing Candy Crush. In early scenes, there's this big disparity in how Hunter is when she's alone and when she's in the presence of her husband and his family and his friends or colleagues. Her docility and idle state are reminiscent of a robot, just waiting for a command when all of its tasks have already been completed. As soon as she hears her husband's car pull up the driveway or his keys at the door, she straightens her back, smiles big, and starts the performance as ideal housewife. Naturally, Hunter's days are empty, her life devoid of meaning, and outside of her husband and his family, she sees no one. She talks to no one. She is a shell. When Hunter finds out she's pregnant, her husband is over the moon and his family is quick to discuss everything she needs to do to ensure her pregnancy goes smoothly, excited at the idea of having another heir to their multi-million-dollar company. But Hunter is lost. She smiles and prepares the nursery, caresses her stomach, but she feels suffocated and confused. This is what she's supposed to want, so why does the idea of staying in her marriage and delivering this baby make her feel so helpless and out of control? Hunter, isolated and dependent on her husband for financial security, has no outlet for these feelings and has no idea what to do with them. Leaving her marriage, terminating her pregnancy, these things are out of the question.
I'm sorry?
Are you happy, or are you pretending to be happy?
I'm happy.
So Hunter continues pretending to be happy, which leads to a new compulsion she doesn't understand, a desire to eat inedible objects. She's both thrilled and terrified by the compulsion, excited to have something that gives her a sense of control over her own body, while also knowing it's putting her and her pregnancy at risk. Mirabella Davis wrote the film as a contribution to his grandmother, a woman whose unhappiness with her life as a housewife eventually led to her being forcefully institutionalized. His grandmother, as he described, developed various rituals of control. She was an obsessive hand washer and would go through 4 cakes of soap a day and 12 bottles of rubbing alcohol a week, and I think she felt a need for order in the life she was powerless in. At the behest of doctors, my grandfather put her into a mental institution where she received electroshock therapy, insulin shock therapy, and non-consensual lobotomy. So she lost her sense of taste and smell, and I always felt there was something punitive about how she was treated, that she was being punished in a way for not living up to society's expectations of what they felt a wife or mother should be.
Come with us quietly, Rosemary. Don't argue or make a scene. Because if you say anything more about witches or witchcraft, we're going to be forced to take you to a mental hospital. You don't want that, do you?
What Hunter struggles to accept and to even make sense of is her own unhappiness, that she doesn't want to be married, she doesn't want to have a child, that her life already feels like it doesn't belong to her. When her compulsion is discovered, her husband's family swoops in and gets her to see a psychiatrist who Hunter struggles to open up to, and when she finally does open up, she quickly finds out that her therapist made a deal with her husband to tell him everything that goes on in their sessions. Like Rosemary, Hunter's privacy is so compromised that it's no longer something she necessarily lacks, but something that is purposefully used to keep her isolated. Sexist power relations operate in and through the private spaces of the home, domestic relationships, and the bodies and psyches of individual men and women. Since Rosemary's exploitation occurs precisely within the privacy of her doctor-patient relationship, her home, her marriage, her body, and even her desires, her privacy is less a sanctuary which is violated than a trap which ensnares her. A better English name for Heseta the Bone Woman would probably be Bone Setter, as observed by the film's director, Michelle Garza Cervera, as it's a story about breaking, but most importantly, a story about healing. Valeria Hernandez prays for a child, and when she falls pregnant, she and her husband Raul are thrilled. But Val's excitement begins to dim as she comes to terms with her feelings toward motherhood. Heseta stands apart from Rosemary's Baby and Swallow in that Valeria's pregnancy itself isn't a horrifying experience. A builder of furniture by trade, Valeria happily makes a crib for her daughter and designs the nursery with a personal and artistic flair. The transformation of her workspace into the baby's nursery is a visual representation of her feelings of motherhood eclipsing her individuality. The closet is full of relics from her past, a guitar, punk albums, a book about Chicana punk history, and eventually her toolbox. Hidden in the shadows, collecting dust. As her stomach swells and her due date gets closer, she's racked with uncertainty, and trips back home only reinforce the idea that she's been playing a role for too long. Inspired in part by the Mexican mythology of La Heseta, a woman who spends her time collecting bones in the desert until she has enough pieces to make something whole again. When she has the full skeleton, she sings life into the bones, and the creature is clothed with flesh, injected with vitality, and it runs into the distance, often transforming into a woman along the way. Ironically, the ending to Heseta and Swallow are controversial for the opposite reasons that the ending to Rosemary's Baby is unsettling. Hunter and Val's decision to prioritize finding freedom and carving out a space for themselves challenges the idea that motherhood is innate. Valeria's decision is especially controversial given that, unlike Hunter, she carries to full term and delivers a healthy baby. What I appreciate most about Val is that she gets to be flawed and maybe even, at times, hard to empathize with. The picture-perfect image of motherhood and maternal devotion gets to be challenged, shattered, and a different image gets to emerge. All three of these movies focus more on a social aspect of motherhood, like the difference in how people treat you, the loss of control or say in your body, and how something as seemingly idyllic as domesticity can be isolating. For the next handful of films, I want to switch gears and look at examples of pregnancy in horror where the very presence of a life forming within you is the thing to fear. One of the first movies I thought of before I started writing this topic was Rosemary's Baby, but the first one I thought of when I considered the horror of unwanted pregnancies was, of course, Alien. The Alien franchise is a psychosexual nightmare that poses philosophical questions regarding God, creation, and has an almost infectious enthusiasm about motherhood. At least that's how I interpret it. To hear writer Dan O'Bannon talk about it, his intent with Alien was to create a sexual fear for the men watching, but fortunately for him, the things he wrote went on to scare everyone.
The whole thing was supposed to be about the sexual life cycle of an alien. That's how I'm going to attack the audience. I'm going to attack them sexually. And I'm not going to go after the women in the audience. I'm going to attack the men. And I'm going to put in every image I can think of that I know will make the men in the audience cross their legs. Homosexual oral rape. Birth. The thing lays its eggs down your throat.
Ronald Shusett, who co-created the story alongside O'Bannon, recalled how the script started to develop when they were in the midst of a creative and financial dry spell. I woke up in the middle of the night and my brain was churning. I said, Dan, I have it. The alien jumps on his face and plants his seed inside him. Then it grows and gestates and comes bursting out of him in the middle of the movie. Within 3 weeks of that moment, the entire structure, with one exception, fell completely into place. Xenomorphs and chestbursters have been part of the pop culture lexicon for so long, nearly 50 years, that it's almost hard to imagine just how insane it must have been for people to see these creature designs for the first time. In 1979, Alien gave audiences a new idea of fear. Although nothing exactly like that had been done before, science fiction stories have always played with the fear of a foreign body taking control of you from within. Parasitic invasions, pod people, invasion of the body snatchers, and of course, the Fly come to mind, the latter of which has its own place among reproductive horror, particularly with Cronenberg's take in 1986. But Alien stood apart in its frank depiction of sexual fear and what is essentially forced pregnancy. The first movie is rife with both yonic and phallic imagery, something that the creatives behind the film were not only aware of, but were very intentional about. O'Bannon's involvement in Alejandro Jodorowsky's unrealized Dune project introduced him to the work of H.R. Giger, whose art became incredibly informative and integral to the creation of Alien as we know it. Giger's painting Necronome 4 became one of the key inspirations to the design of the xenomorph. When production for the film got off the ground, Giger was brought in to design quite a few elements, including the facehuggers who, are basically a penis and a vulva. He also designed the abandoned spacecraft known as the Derelict, which emits a warning that the crew mistakes for an SOS signal. The design of the Derelict is a beautiful fusion of the organic and industrial, machines blending into bodies, high-tech equipment that resembles body parts, not to mention the ovomorphs, or alien eggs, which were originally designed to mirror the look of the vulva as well. John L. Cobbs describes the look of the Derelict wonderfully in his essay, Alien as Abortion Parable. Alien achieves a strange balance between the cold, steely world of technology and forms constantly evocative flesh-erotic flesh in particular. Not since Flash Gordon has the world of science fiction been so erotically evocative. Vaginal doorways, cervical mazes on the walls, phallic sculptures in the alien spaceship, and bulbous mammary projections everywhere. Virtually every scene works itself out within a matrix of sexual suggestiveness. Despite how explicitly sexual Alien is, and despite it operating pretty much exclusively as a movie and franchise about reproductive cycles, its place in the subgenre can be dismissed and sometimes is on account of how different pregnancy looks in these films. There is rarely a ballooning stomach, and the hosts chosen by the ovomorphs have no strange cravings or aches or pains. Like John Hurt's Cain, most of the hosts that facehuggers attach themselves to are subdued during the implantation process and may come away from the invasion with a slight fever, if that, but for the most part seem fine. Until they go into labor, that is. The aliens have an urgency to their methods, and I like how their efficiency, let's just call it that, is described in the novelization of the film written by Alan Dean Foster. An interspecies parasite, capable of preying on any life form that breathes, regardless of the atmospheric composition involved. One capable of lying dormant for indefinite periods under the most inhospitable conditions, its sole purpose to reproduce its own kind, a task it pursues with supreme efficiency. There is nothing in mankind's experience to compare with it. The efficiency of the xenomorphs was also noted by film critic and theorist Barbara Creed in her famous, highly regarded text, The Monstrous Feminine. The book contains a section on Alien and how it presents the archaic mother. Creed uses the term, originating from Sigmund Freud, to refer to the archetype of the mother figure in horror and science fiction, particularly how the archaic mother is both friend and foe, victim and villain. In Alien, the archaic mother wears many faces. The archaic mother is the ovomorph, the xenomorph, or even the queen who makes her first appearance in Aliens. Creed describes the role of the archaic mother as, the central characteristic of the archaic mother is her total dedication to the generative, procreative principle. She is the mother who conceives all by herself, the original parent, the godhead of all fertility, and the origin of procreation. She is outside morality and the law. I've seen Alien countless times, and I've thought about the reproductive element, of course, but rewatching it while having abortion bans in mind was kind of funny because sometimes I stopped seeing the xenomorphs as predatory creatures hell-bent on propagation and started seeing them as predatory politicians hell-bent on propagation. Come on, it's kind of funny. I think all of us, even you watching, have our own little qualms about Prometheus. But one thing I think most can agree on is that the movie leaning harder into the question of creation was a natural progression for a franchise that started with a movie that was all about the reproductive cycle of an alien. Characters ponder the purpose of their place in the universe, where they came from, and what it all means. And with a name like Prometheus, taken from the Titan in Greek myth who stole fire from the gods and gave it to humanity, the themes about the cycle of creation and destruction are very apparent. This installment in the franchise is also significant when we talk about reproductive horror because of one pivotal scene that almost didn't make the final cut. So in the movie, Elizabeth Shaw, played by Noomi Rapace, desperately wants to find answers. Answers for religion, for why she exists, for where she and all of humanity came from. When she, along with her partner Charlie, get a chance to explore a star map on a spacecraft called Prometheus, Elizabeth thinks she's going to find the answers to the questions that have plagued her for her entire life. Their crew is outfitted with 4 other members, including David, a synthetic who, like many of his kind, is sent on these expeditions as a helpful gizmo, and Peter Wayland, a billionaire who has his heart set on finding the fountain of youth and reversing his old age. After they land on a planet that seems completely devoid of life, they do some exploring, and David finds some black goo, which he takes with him back to the ship, using it to spike Charlie's drink. The black goo, which was created by the engineers, an alien species, is both an aid and a weapon. It has the ability to create life and to destroy it. Charlie later has sex with Elizabeth, and this pays off when, a very short time later, Elizabeth discovers that somehow she is 3 months pregnant with Charlie's alien goo-infected baby. A terrifying realization, both because of the advanced stage of the pregnancy and because she was thought to have been infertile. Elizabeth's abdomen becomes a nightmare of its own as this inhuman fetus grows at a rapid pace, and Elizabeth is determined to get it out of her. The scene that follows is her requesting a cesarean from the automated surgeon on board. Her request is denied, and she has to make adjustments to the machine in order for it to cut the creature out of her abdomen. This scene is claustrophobic, anxiety-inducing, and of course, bloody. It's one of the more direct instances in the Alien franchise of a pregnancy termination happening on screen. We see something similar in Alien 3 when Ripley finds out she's been implanted and sacrifices herself immediately, but as far as surgical depictions of what is essentially an abortion go, Prometheus takes the cake. Actress Noomi Rapace had this to say about that scene. I think the scene kind of captures the whole question about creating life, and what if the child and the thing that you created starts to turn against you. We have those snakes in Sweden, black and yellow snakes, and they give birth to their babies up in trees. The babies fall down and the babies are poisonous. They'll bite and kill the mother if she's close to them. I think this scene embraces the whole problematic and disturbed relationship between parents and children. It's creating life, but with some kind of savage beauty. There's a callback to this scene and Rapace's observations about the relationship between parents and children in Fede Alvarez's Alien Romulus. Like every installment in the franchise, Romulus follows a group of people who end up in the spacecraft and are picked off one by one. One of the characters in this installment is Kay, who is already pregnant before the adventure begins. Kay's pregnancy is still in its early stages. She's not showing, and she hasn't figured out a way to tell anyone yet. Especially not her brother Tyler, the only family she has left. Well, not really, because speaking of family, the father of Kay's baby is her cousin, Bjorn, giving an extra layer of abomination to the reveal of the offspring at the very end. Kay survives for most of the movie despite of, and because of her decision to inject herself with the Z01 compound, a solution extracted from the DNA of a xenomorph, which immediately heals all of her wounds. Even if you haven't seen Romulus, you know where this is going. After it looks like Kay and the remaining crew are going to make it through, Kay's stasis chamber goes berserk, alerting Rain of some abnormalities with her health. And then the reveal. Kay now appears to be about 9 months pregnant and is ready to deliver. The next 15 minutes are joyously insane. So Kay pops out a sac that bursts with a half-human, half-xenomorph monstrosity called the Offspring, which has a lot in common with the newborn from Alien Resurrection in that both are disturbing, and I hate looking at them. The Offspring nurses from Kay's limp body, drains her of the Z01 compound, and goes from being the stuff of nightmares to being the stuff of sleep paralysis terror. Great scene, great creature design. No notes. The franchise has always been about creation and motherhood, but Romulus, along with Prometheus, is one of the first times we see the alien pregnancy depicted in a less abstract, less metaphorical way. Elizabeth's abortion, Kay's delivery, their panic and repulsion at the things that have been expelled from their bodies. When the chest bursters start to break free in Alien, the horror being presented, the horror that gets under your skin, is the idea of having something inside you that you don't want there, that you can't get out, and that you know is going to kill you. The Suckling is a Z-horror creature feature slasher about an aborted fetus that gets flushed down the toilet, ends up in the sewage where exposure to toxic waste mutates it into a giant monster, and it goes on a killing spree, eventually making its way back to its mother, shrinking down to normal fetus size, and forcing its way back into her womb. There isn't much to be said about The Suckling, or most Z-horror slashers about abortions for that matter. Even though it is good bad movie schlock that's fun to watch with your friends, it also presents some ideas that are unfortunately par for the course when it comes to media depictions of abortions or abortionists at the time. I could dismiss it because it's all played for laughs, but I think it's important to look at what's going on a little bit. Rebecca, the main character, doesn't want the abortion, and the abortionist, a woman named Big Mama, who's also the madam of a brothel for some reason, doesn't care what she wants. Big Mama and Rebecca's boyfriend conspire to drug Rebecca, and the abortion is performed as she's passed out without her consent. I think it's a good thing to showcase examples of forced abortion and forced sterilization. abortion, because it's weird to talk about the history of reproductive health in general, let alone in a horror fiction context, without also acknowledging its horrific history. More on that later. And I acknowledge that it's very weird to ask that of a movie like The Suckling, and to be clear, I'm not saying that's the kind of movie it must be. The Suckling isn't meant to be some sort of meditation on the roots of gynecology, and it isn't meant to show the perspective of, say, a young woman who wants to see her pregnancy through, a young woman being forced into doing something she doesn't want to satisfy her boyfriend and an evil abortionist. It's the kind of movie that's not supposed to say much of anything, let alone shedding light on the dark past of gynecology and reproductive health. That said, it is saying a lot. The movie takes place not in the traditional abortion clinic, but a back alley place that doubles as a brothel. There's a pretty obvious connection here between the act of terminating a pregnancy and being a sex worker, with the writer-director Francis Terry putting both of these things in the evil bucket. Historically, abortion has been associated with perversion and vulgarity in so-called fast women, so much so that as abortion was increasingly criminalized, the general public stopped thinking of it as a genuine medical procedure. There's room for movies like these, movies that also show the perspectives of people who want to keep their children, but The Suckling has no sympathy for its main character, hence her being punished when her fetus forces its way back into her body. A real antithesis to The Suckling can be found in the Masters of Horror episode Pro-Life, directed by John Carpenter. This episode starts with a teenager named Angelique who is running away from something or someone. Angelique almost gets hit by a car carrying a doctor and a nurse who work at the local clinic. After stopping just in time, the two take Angelique to their clinic to get her checked out in case there was any damage they couldn't detect on the road. Angelique says she believes God guided them to her because he wants them to abort the baby growing inside her. Meanwhile, her religious fundamentalist, gun-toting father waits outside the clinic, demanding that they send his daughter out. While waiting, he hears what he believes to be the voice of God telling him to protect the baby at all costs, which leads to him and his sons gunning down a lot of people. Angelique's belly continues to grow, and she soon gives birth to a little devil baby. The demon ascends from the ground to claim his new spawn, and Ron Perlman realizes he was hearing the voice of the devil, after all. Then Angelique shoots the baby in the head. An element of this episode that I quite like is how the irony of a lot of pro-life activists is highlighted through Ron Perlman's character, who is very much against abortion, claiming that every life is precious. And he shows this by killing a bunch of people to get into the clinic. I don't know, it's like watching Kate Ivey sign the Human Life Protection Act to keep children safe, while building a mega prison with money taken from the state's education fund. You can't make this shit up. Horror movies where abortion or even contraceptives take center stage are rare, the political connotations proving to be too much for some. But when these topics are encroached, it's like a box of chocolates. You never know if you're going to get a nuanced depiction or, the anti-abortion horror movie The Life Zone. In a movie like The Suckling, and a little bit with It's Alive, there's this side dish of blame and shame handed to the expectant mother, regardless of whether she wants to keep her baby or not. Erin Harrington observes as much in her book, Women, Monstrosity, and Horror Film, Gyna Horror, stating, in each of these films, the aborted, disposed of fetus fights back against the abortionists or their mother, exhibiting perhaps a greater capacity to act than its mother ever did, while the mother is denigrated for her weakness and her choices, and sometimes objectified through her association with prostitution. Shaming mothers doesn't start after they have their children. It starts long before they even have children, based on how they handle unexpected pregnancies. It starts when they're carrying and everyone around them decides that now that they're expecting, they've officially become a bumbling idiot who can't make their own choices. And since most people who decide to have children, mothers especially, are acutely aware of how much of a responsibility it is, that shame can be used to isolate, manipulate. You can even profit from it.
Please don't read books. No pregnancy was ever exactly like the ones described in the books. And don't listen to your friends either.
Marketing only works by appealing to our deepest insecurities. Advertisements show us a picture of our ideal selves, and we buy into the dream in the hopes of getting one step closer. Sometimes this is not exactly innocent, but let's just say it's less sinister. Like when you think buying a spin mop is going to make you a fundamentally better person. Other times, it's deeper. Like when you're selling classes to expected mothers full of misinformation and telling them that if they choose to give birth with the help of a doula or a hospital, then they're not doing the best thing for their child. Put a pin in that. There's one thing I didn't mention about Rosemary's Baby. Early in the movie, Minnie gives Rosemary a pungent amulet to wear, telling her that it's for her protection. Dr. Saperstein isn't the only new medical advisor in Rosemary's life. Minnie also takes on the role of at-home caregiver, administering herbal medicines to Rosemary that seem to make her worse, not better. When I rewatched the movie to write this essay, I had already written a brief section about midwifery, misogyny, and what was basically the rebranding of pregnancy and birth. But after viewing the movie again, I started to see how Rosemary's Baby kind of shows how precarious the relationship between doctor and patient, or doula and patient, can be. How bad faith actors can move into either profession and jeopardize the health of the patient with their carelessness and or greed. In the beginning, the delivery of babies was a woman's work. Everything to do with women and their reproductive health was a woman's work. Whether it was giving birth or helping someone terminate a pregnancy, the experts were women, and for a long time, midwifery was the only form of consistent work a woman could earn a living under. For widows and older women, this is what kept them afloat. They delivered babies, nursed pregnant women through nausea or pains, and when requested, terminated pregnancies. Every culture, place, and time used something a little different. In America, calamus, for example, was used as an abortifacient by many Native American tribes, including the Cree and Lenape, along with red cedar, blue cohosh, and of course, pennyroyal tea. But the practice of midwifery and abortifacients were soon under attack as the land expanded and technological advancements moved modern medicine into a new direction. What happened really is that men started to see the value in healing, and especially in birth, and naturally that meant the women in midwifery had to get out of the way. Professional midwives, meaning midwives who were actually receiving pay for their work, unlike the enslaved midwives who assisted other enslaved women, knew exactly what was happening, and many of them pushed back, like Margaret Stone and Elizabeth Nihell, who published a treatise on the art of midwifery in 1760. In this, she expresses concern over the infant and maternal mortality rate, which she feared would increase when human beings in midwifery were replaced with tools. She also ruminates on the growing number of male physicians who were advocating for midwifery as a whole to be abolished. But if they so falsely exalt their own learning above the ignorance of women, they have their reason for it. They seek to drive out of the practice those who stand in the way of their private interest, that private interest to which the public is forever sacrificed under the species and style pretext of its advancement. So the AMA was established and midwifery became public enemy number one. Not only was midwifery bad and uncivilized, but it was legitimately evil, and I don't know if you've heard, but these so-called midwives were delivering babies just to eat them or feed them to Satan. It's true. Those midwives and wise women who are witches in the habit of offering to Satan the little children which they deliver, and then of killing them, they do even worse, for they kill them while they are yet in their mother's wombs. This practice is common to all witches. The midwife is a relic of barbarism. In civilized countries, the midwife is wrong, has always been wrong. The midwife has been a drag on the progress of the science and art of obstetrics. Her existence stunts the one and degrades the other. For many centuries, she perverted obstetrics from obtaining any standing at all among the science of medicine, even after midwifery was practiced by some of the most brilliant men in the profession. Such practice was held opprobrious and degraded. In historian John Riddle's book, Eve's Herbs, A History of Contraception and Abortion in the West, a book I highly recommend, by the way, because it's pretty fascinating stuff, he writes about how midwives were vilified to the extent that a few of them were even accused of witchcraft. He acknowledges that during the height of something like, say, the Salem witch trials, there weren't a significant amount of midwives who were executed for being a witch. There were only a few. But the history still points toward a coordinated effort to associate midwifery, something that had been around for centuries at that point, with something evil and unnatural. Midwives were the victims of a vicious syllogism. To know the secrets was to be a witch. It was necessary to know the secrets to be a midwife. Therefore, a midwife is a witch. The secrets were not necessarily the so-called witch's ointment. They were the formulas needed for the care of women, including, in some cases, contraceptives and abortifacients. Herbs that had been employed in the popular culture for millennia moved from medical lore to magic lore, known only to those with malevolent motives. Even now, centuries later, midwifery is still under attack, and it is simultaneously becoming more and more appealing to new mothers. The World Health Organization found in 2015 that unwarranted cesareans were becoming common to the point of concern, since most pregnancies don't call for surgical intervention. The rate of cesareans across the world has steadily increased. In 1990, the worldwide rate for C-sections was around 7%. By 2021, it was at 21%. And if this trend continues, we expect to see the cesarean rate at 29% by 2030. And a lot of the time, these interventions are unnecessary, often creating more health risks, both short-term and long-term, for new mothers and their children. C-sections have a purpose, and they're very helpful in the cases of pregnancies where vaginal delivery could be life-threatening. But more and more often these days, we're seeing C-sections used when there's no risk with the pregnancy at all. The increase of invasive surgeries during routine deliveries and the increase of the maternal and infant mortality rate has led to many people wanting to turn away from doctors and hospitals during their pregnancies. In large droves, women are returning to a less invasive childbirth, with more and more people seeking out the help of doulas and midwives. I want to be as clear as I possibly can here when I say it's not a bad thing for women to turn to midwives and doulas. I also don't think midwives and doulas are less valuable or something. I know many midwives, many doulas, and they all do amazing work. They know how to help mothers, babies, how to make delivery smooth and safe, because after all, it's a pretty harrowing experience, especially for first-time mothers. They also know when to take a baby or a mother to the hospital. They know what to look for when something isn't right, and they know how to take action. I don't have a problem with doulas or midwives, and I admire the work they do. What I have a problem with is when people abuse the midwife and or doula title and use expectant mothers' understandable distrust of the medical system to spread misinformation and convince people with risky pregnancies that there's never any danger in delivering a baby. That is, quite simply, fucked up. So the Free Birth Society, or FBS, was created by Emily Saldaya in 2017. FBS is a business that advocates for free birth, which is basically delivery without hospitals, doctors, and in some cases even without doulas. Delivery would happen at home or in a place where a new mother would feel safe, and ideally the labor would be completely unassisted. Free birth is an understandable decision, especially with women who previously had traumatic childbirths in hospital. Some women who spoke about why they wanted to pursue free birth talked about surgeries performed on them without their consent, medications given to them that they didn't want, or doctors who didn't listen to their concerns. For some women, completely unassisted home birth is a choice, and for others who have limited access to midwives, it's a matter of convenience and affordability. Most people who advocate for free birth or home birth also speak about the importance of making sure everything with your pregnancy is in order. That means ultrasounds, prenatal care, postpartum care, etc. FBS is different. FBS believes that ultrasounds are harmful to the fetus, that prenatal care is unnecessary, and that there's no such thing as a risky pregnancy. Journalists Ciaran Cale and Lucy Osborne researched the Free Birth Society and its founders for over a year and found that the business is linked to a fairly significant amount of infant deaths around the world. A closer look at the business model, where Saldaya and co-founder Norris Clark sold classes to thousands for up to $300, reveals that the issue doesn't lie with home births as a whole, but with what Saldaya and Norris Clark were advocating for and against. For example, Saldaya has stated that she would never resuscitate a newborn child because they should learn to breathe on their own.
According to experts, they also made false or dangerous claims about hemorrhage, shoulder dystocia, retained placenta, newborn resuscitation, and the risk of infection.
Even if contagion were real, even if infection, the way that we're taught it within the allopathic sphere, were real, there would be a pretty much 0% chance of anything happening, even if you did cut a baby's cord with like an old rusty fork or whatever.
Together, the pair developed a dogmatic approach at odds with the wider unassisted birth community, whose members attend medical appointments, seek ultrasounds to help them make informed choices, and have emergency plans. By contrast, FBS taught that even contemplating a backup plan was a sign of moral failure, because the truly sovereign woman trusted birth. You have to choose one world or the other, Norris Clark told followers in a video call. And if you're setting up a medical team in the room next door, you're not getting the best of both worlds. You're choosing the medical world. Norris Clark and Saldaya have spread so much misinformation to their thousands of paying customers, like telling them not to resuscitate, not to get any sort of prenatal care, and not to believe it when they're told they have high-risk pregnancies. Sometimes a mother going into labor, or just having delivered, would contact Saldaya with questions and would be assured that everything was fine, even when it clearly wasn't. One woman who reached out to Saldaya asked if it was normal that her baby was still struggling to breathe 3 hours after delivery. And Saldaya said, "That all sounds totally normal." I don't want to get completely into the FBS cult. I mean, business, because there's still a lot of things I don't know, and I only read a handful of articles while I was in the middle of writing the script for this video. Still, I wanted to bring it up here because women burned by terribly traumatic experiences with doctors and hospitals, women who were on the brink of death with their pregnancies, are obviously afraid to experience something like that again. And with the maternal mortality rate where it's at, why the hell wouldn't they be? There are real issues with America's medical system, and the fear these women are feeling, their reluctance at having something so unsettling happen again, is completely understandable. And FBS is preying on that trauma, on that fear, and it's scary. They're using the age-old tactic of mother shaming to convince these women that if they have a backup plan, if they want to have an ultrasound, they're doing the worst thing they can do for their baby. And that is sick.
Obstetrics is, it's the devil, to put it mildly.
I mentioned Rosemary's Baby at the beginning of this section again because after I found out about the Free Birth Society and its failures, I saw another aspect to Rosemary's experiences. Many with her herbs and organic medicines could be a stand-in for people like Saldaya, using terms like homeopathic and natural to dissuade women from getting second opinions about their pregnancies. It's also kind of funny that many would be the actual witch midwives were accused of being. Dr. Saperstein and Dr. Hill could be stand-ins for the bad actors within the medical system that make women feel unheard and traumatized. And at the end of the day, whether it's a bad actor in midwifery or free birth or professional medicine, the woman seeking the best for her unborn child is cheated either way. Margaret Atwood has always been clear that she doesn't think of her book, The Handmaid's Tale, the story of Offred, a woman living in a society where women are bred like cattle, as a speculative narrative. She made a rule for herself when writing the book that she wouldn't put anything in that hadn't already been done by humans, to humans, in real life. The group activated hangings, the tearing apart of human beings, the clothing specific to castes and classes, the forced childbearing and the appropriation of the results, the children stolen by regimes and placed for upbringing with high-ranking officials, the forbidding of literacy, the denial of property rights. All had precedents, and many of these were to be found not in other cultures and religions, but within Western society, and within the Christian tradition itself. There are a lot of things I don't quite agree with Atwood about, but this point she never fails to make about The Handmaid's Tale is not one of them, and it's something that I'm glad she maintains. I can't be the only person who wants to roll my eyes when yet another reproductive right is either revoked or ignored, and someone who thinks they're being clever says, "This is like something out of The Handmaid's Tale." I probably shouldn't bristle at that, but I do. Because I'm petty. But also because statements like that, along with a lot of entries into the reproductive horror genre, particularly the less metaphorical ones, tend to look at the issue with a narrow lens. And what do I mean by that? Okay, well, when my white peers read The Handmaid's Tale for the first time, they spoke about a dystopia where things like that could happen. Whereas when I read it for the first time, I thought about a reality, a history, where things like that did happen. When I read the book, I didn't think of a far-off dystopian future first. I thought of chattel slavery and the forced reproduction of enslaved women, many who would later have to watch as their children were ripped from their arms and sold to different slave owners, sometimes across state lines, never to be seen again. I thought of the auction blocks and the flyers that advertised enslaved people for sale and emphasized which of them would be good for reproducing. Terms like buck or wench or fancy. I thought of enslaved men and women being forced to have sex, sometimes with the slave owner watching them. On this plantation were more than 100 slaves who were mated indiscriminately and without any regard for family unions. If their master thought that a certain man and woman might have strong, healthy offspring, he forced them to have sexual relation, even though they were married to other slaves. If there seemed to be any slight reluctance on the part of either of the unfortunate ones, Big Jim would make them consummate this relationship in his presence. He used the same procedure if he thought a certain couple was not producing children fast enough. He enjoyed these orgies very much, and often entertained his friends in this manner. Quite often he and his guests would engage in these debaucheries, choosing for themselves the prettiest of the young women. Sometimes they forced the unhappy husbands and lovers of their victims to look on. In writing about depictions of reproductive health in the horror genre, and watching a lot of movies, back to back to back, It's hard not to notice how very rarely women of color show up in these stories, particularly for the stories coming out of North America and Europe. You knew it was coming. It always comes up in my videos because I can't help but notice it. There are some people who don't think it's that big of a deal, the dearth of on-screen representation of marginalized groups. And it's my understanding that for some of them, it's less important than real-life injustices, so there's no reason to talk about it. But we learn a lot through our culture. Our movies, our shows, our music. It tells us a lot about what's valued, who's valued, what isn't, what's normalized, and what's vilified. And the lack of movies about the horrors faced by Black women when it comes to their health, especially when it's to do with reproduction, bothers me, not just because I'm a Black woman and I like seeing fair representation on screen. It also bothers me because it ends up repeating an issue that is having a very real impact on Black women seeking medical care for their pregnancies in America. Historically, Black women weren't even a thought in the fight for gender equality or the suffrage movement. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony fought for the right to vote for women, yes. But they didn't mean all women. They specifically had middle to upper class white women in mind. The idea that a Black woman could still be considered a woman didn't even seem to cross their minds. In 1971, Toni Morrison wrote the famous op-ed on the issue. It is a source of amusement, even now, to Black women to listen to feminists talk of liberation while somebody's nice Black grandmother shoulders the daily responsibility of child rearing and floor mopping, and the liberated one comes home to examine the housekeeping, correct it, and be entertained by the children. If women's lib needs those grandmothers to thrive, it has a serious flaw. Black women were frequently shut out of white feminist movements, but naturally they had a place in movements for the bettering of the lives of Black people, like the Civil Rights era, before, and beyond. Too often Black women were put in a position where they had to make a choice, where they were asked whether they cared more about having rights as a woman or having rights as a Black person. The idea that they had to exist and navigate life as both seemed to confound everyone. Typically, when you are given the most simple breakdown of the fight for reproductive rights in America, you hear about the AMA ousting midwives, you hear about the uptick in abortion criminalization, you hear about Margaret Sanger and Planned Parenthood, the San Francisco 9, Roe v. Wade, the Heartbeat Act. But in this simplified breakdown of the history of the fight for reproductive rights in the United States, people get erased. People like, for example, Betsy, Lucy, and Anna Kerr Westcott, 3 enslaved girls whose health deteriorated so badly after traumatic childbirths that their captors agreed to let them be experimented on by the man who would later be called the father of gynecology, J. Marion Sims. These experiments weren't agreed on because anyone cared about whether they were healthy or not. It was really only a matter of getting them back to work. There were more enslaved women Sims experimented on during his many years trying to perfect surgery and examinations, but many of them have already been erased and forgotten. And today, we only know the names of 3. In the 60s and the 70s, during the height of the pre-Roe reproductive activism, women of color didn't feel entirely the same as white women when it came to the concept of birth control, because there was baggage there. Middle-class white women wanted access to abortions and birth control, and for the most part, that was the extent of the reproductive conversation. Women of color wanted access to birth control and abortions, and they also wanted to be able to decide when, where, how they would have their children, and even more simply, that they got to have children at all. It is important to talk about the role forced sterilization plays in reproductive history. In Women, Race, and Class, Angela Davis writes, "The failure of the abortion rights campaign to conduct a historical self-evaluation led to a dangerously superficial appraisal of Black people's suspicious attitudes toward birth control in general. Granted, when some Black people unhesitatingly equated birth control with genocide, it did appear to be an exaggerated, even paranoid, reaction. Yet white abortion rights activists missed a profound message. For underlying these cries of genocide were important clues about the history of the birth control movement. This movement, for example, had been known to advocate involuntary sterilization, a racist form of mass birth control. If ever women would enjoy the right to plan their pregnancies, legal and easily accessible birth control measures and abortions would have to be complemented by an end to sterilization abuse." It's a known fact that Margaret Sanger, founder of Planned Parenthood, ended up aligning herself with the eugenics movement in America. She believed that if quote-unquote unfit people were sterilized, it would root out any qualities deemed unworthy and make humanity better for it. I mean, Sanger was so dedicated to the cause, she even gave a speech to the Women's Auxiliary of the Ku Klux Klan, a speech all about the importance of eugenics. In 1927, Buck v. Bell grabbed the nation's attention. Carrie Buck was an 18-year-old girl forcefully institutionalized by her own family after falling pregnant. At the same time, her family claimed her pregnancy was due to her sinful actions, but decades later, this idea was contested, and it is thought that Buck was assaulted. While Buck was in the care of the hospital, its director, Dr. Albert Sidney Pretty, filed a petition to sterilize her. The case made its way to the Supreme Court, and the argument was made that to sterilize so-called feeble-minded people like Buck was for the greater good, and it was ruled that it was not only legal but justified to forcefully sterilize people deemed to be unfit for the protection and health of the state. When sterilization was upheld, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes said, "It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime, or let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from breeding their kind." Fast forward to 1973, the same year of the Roe v. Wade decision. Two sisters aged 12 and 14 made headlines after they were taken to a clinic and ended up being sterilized. It goes without saying that this was non-consensual. I mean, even if the girls agreed to it, which they didn't, they were 12 and 14. The two Montgomery Community Action social workers who picked the girls up had their mother, who could not read or write, sign a document with X. She'd been told the girls were receiving shots. There was a similar sort of deceit and coercion that led to the case of Madrigal v. Killigan in 1976, where 10 brave women filed a class action lawsuit against a Los Angeles medical center of obstetrics for either sterilizing them without consent or not giving them full information about the procedure, or for telling them it was reversible. These women were all Mexican American, living in a predominantly Latin community during a time where the forced sterilization of any woman with a Spanish name was very common, especially in California. The court ruled in favor of the hospital and said it was just a case of miscommunication due to language barriers. The IHS, or Indian Health Service, which was created to improve access to healthcare for Native families, has been linked to countless sterilizations since its creation in the 1950s. Activists brought more attention to it during the 70s, with groups like Women of All Red Nations, or WARN, bringing the topic of coordinated sterilization of Native women to the forefront. When the General Accounting Office investigated the allegations, they deduced that there wasn't enough evidence to corroborate these claims. However, the investigation led to a lot of major changes in how the IHS was supposed to go about getting consent for these surgeries. Even if GAO couldn't corroborate the claims, the way IHS went about getting consent was muddy at best and outright manipulative at worst, and anyone could see that. Mila Vicente Carpio writes in The Lost Generation, American Indian Women and Sterilization Abuse, "Another woman spoke of being lied to or given misinformation when she went for a doctor's appointment. The physician suggested that she needed vitamins. The vitamins turned out to be birth control pills." Moreover, another woman related that she had gone to see a doctor and was told that her severe headaches were a result of a fear of pregnancy, that she was afraid to get pregnant. Therefore, she should be sterilized to rid herself of the headaches. In fact, this woman had a brain tumor.
All these your babies, Miss Mary?
Yes, these are all my babies. Delivered about 1,400.
When we talk about the history of midwives in America and the abortifacients they used, here too, women of color are often left out of the conversation. Older enslaved women often helped expecting mothers through childbirth, having done so decades while being held captive. But their experience with midwifery is undermined in history and was undermined at the time. Mary Breckinridge, the founder of the Frontier Nursing Service, who advocated for midwifery and taught midwives how to assist families and mothers throughout Appalachia during a time when very few were paying attention to the health of rural communities, was also a white supremacist who didn't allow black midwives to enter her school. These women also knew what plants to use and how to use them to terminate a pregnancy should another woman wish it. Adedoyin Adekunle wrote in her essay Enslaved Women, Reproductive Choices in Medicine, despite uncovering that enslaved black women on his plantation did kill their children with the use of medicine in 1847, the infant mortality rate on his plantation continued for 4 more consecutive years. Finally, in 1851, he was able to fish out the presence of a black medicine expert on his plantation and found out that enslaved people had continued to practice African folk cures and remedies, one of which included gynecological resistance, in order not to multiply the number of enslaved people on his plantation. Abortions and infanticide were common during the era of slavery, not just on plantations but off them. Take the famous case of Margaret Garner. Garner had run away from a plantation with her husband Robert and their 4 children. When slave catchers pressures caught up with him, Garner murdered her 2-year-old daughter in an act of desperation, and she planned to kill all 3 of her children because seeing them dead was more bearable than seeing them enslaved. When the trial began, the biggest question that stumped the court was how to proceed with the case because they weren't sure if a slave woman should be tried as a person or property. The fact that enslaved women would terminate their pregnancies or kill their own children wasn't their way of trying to grab a little freedom for themselves. It wasn't done for independence or even for health. Most of the time, these were acts of desperation, acts of love. In most cases, the enslaved women who killed their children or ended their pregnancies would have probably liked to keep their children, but bringing them into a world where they'd be deemed property, where they would have no bodily autonomy, no rights, no freedom, that felt unjust. Why were self-imposed abortions and reluctant acts of infanticide such common occurrences during slavery? Not because Black women had discovered solutions to their predicament, but rather because they were desperate. Abortions and infanticides were acts of desperation, motivated not by the biological birth process, but by the oppressive conditions of slavery. Most of these women, no doubt, would have expressed their deepest resentment had someone hailed their abortions as a stepping stone toward freedom. The horror genre as well as the science fiction genre have long been entranced with the idea of creating life, and sometimes it comes in the form of mad scientists, other times in the form of would-be mothers. This obsession with life and the creation of it isn't unique to fiction. It's this very obsession that has led to the criminalization of pregnancy preventions and terminations over many decades. It's this obsession with creating life that leads to lawmakers valuing a fetus over a woman. In their eyes, her ability to create life is the thing that gives her life value, not her own life or her own so-called personhood. The creation of new life is deemed more important than the quality of life for someone already living, which is how you get people publicly calling for the executions of the homeless, because after all, saying all lives matter is really just something to say, not something to actually mean. Across the board, maternal mortality rates are lower than they were before modern medicine, but in the grand scheme of things, still way too high, unacceptably high, for the technology and knowledge we currently have. According to the CDC, 80% of pregnancy-related deaths in the United States are preventable. Some of these preventions include things like health aides who know what the hell they're talking about, education about pregnancy risks, and in some cases, simply being able to terminate a pregnancy. Maternal mortality disproportionately affects Black women, and they are 3 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related illnesses than white women. Part of that has to do with income disparity, as women in poverty, for example, are less likely to be able to afford decent health care. Part of that is due to medical racism and the long-held belief that Black people felt less pain than other racial groups, which unfortunately is still believed by way too many doctors and medical establishments. Like, sure, it's gone down since the days of the exploitation of Sarah Baartman, yes, but there are still way too many doctors who dismiss Black women's concerns about their health, convinced that when they say they're in pain or that they're worried, that they're just lying or they want attention. In the case of Tiara Walker, a woman who died from pregnancy-related health complications, the dismissal of her concerns and her pain was not just from 1 or 2 doctors. Walker sought help from 90 different physicians, being turned away over and over. Walker resided in Texas, where almost all abortions were banned in 2022, with no exceptions being made for the cases of rape or incest. Texas allows abortions if the pregnancy proves to be life-threatening, but this caveat is wrapped in layers of confusing and vague vernacular designed to sow doubt and fear. Texans who administer abortions can face up to life in prison and have to jump through hoops to prove that the risk posed to a pregnant patient seeking an abortion are indeed life-threatening. When Walker asked for anyone to clear the termination of her pregnancy, no doctor was willing to take on the risk of performing the procedure, and many of them wouldn't even discuss the only move that could have saved her life. A landmark case that helped turn the tide on reproductive health was Sherry Chesson, a woman who struggled to get an abortion in the United States was mostly met with sympathy. In 1962, Chesson began seeking an abortion after realizing some sleeping medication she'd taken contained a drug that had been found to cause birth defects and in some cases, death. Chesson's physician arranged for the pregnancy to be terminated in Phoenix, where she resided, and after the appointment was made, Chesson wanted to warn other women, so she talked to the press. The article exploded, and because her anonymity was not protected, everyone knew her name. The appointment she previously made in Phoenix was canceled by the organization, so Chesson and her husband traveled to Japan, then Sweden to get the procedure done. Reproductive health, including contraception, was often associated with promiscuity. Abortions were considered to be done only by those who were sexually sexually uninhibited. Single women and spinsters bore the brunt of the blowback. So Chesson was a unique figure that challenged how Americans viewed abortions and how they viewed the people who sought them. In many ways, she became the ideal face of reproductive health. She was married, she was already a mother, and she had a career of her own as a beloved television host of the Phoenix iteration of Romper Room. She was middle class and appropriate and not at all what most people thought of when they thought of abortion. In her book, Wonder Drug, Jennifer Vanderbees writes of Chesson's public perception. Her wholesome image clashed so dramatically with the public's concept of abortion, the lawless choice of wayward women, that her decision to go through with the procedure sparked a heated national debate. Chesson, being white, middle class, and financially capable of leaving the country to seek an abortion, painted a picture of how difficult it was to get proper reproductive care. If someone in her position can face this many obstacles, what chance do women in the lower class or different racial groups stand? What of the women who can't afford to leave the state to get an abortion, let alone the entire country? Many of these movies intentionally reflect the experiences of women like Chesson, focusing on women who are upper class and or married to highlight how difficult it is even for women with more options and better access to quality healthcare. This can work. Still, I'm inclined to be critical of the one-sided depictions of reproductive horror in fiction because their tendency to skew toward a certain type of character just barely scratches the surface. Sometimes I look at the movies or shows that fall under this subgenre and marvel that something so subversive with a topic that is still so controversial can be so limited in its scope and confrontation of the impact of these life-threatening laws. But even with my frustration at the genre's limits, I can only be so bothered. I mean, when the real-life horrors of reproductive health being clawed back to deadly consequences are right here, when the Tierra Walkers of the world are having their pleas ignored, when the Adriana Smiths of the world are being kept alive by machines so their bodies can serve as incubators, when preventable deaths continue to rise because doctors are afraid to sign off on life-saving procedures, the fictional horrors might as well be an escape from the real ones.